Mia stood frozen at the door, her heart pounding. Through the glass, she saw Catherine, her stepmother, locked in a passionate kiss with a man Mia didn't recognize. As soon as Catherine saw Mia, her smile faded. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice dripping with anger. The man quickly ran off, but Catherine grabbed Mia by the arm. "If you tell Richard, I'll make sure he disowns you. You think he'll believe you? I have him wrapped around my finger." Mia's heart raced, and just as she thought the worst was over, Catherine's face twisted into something darker. "Don't ever speak of this again. Understand?" The coldness in her voice sent a shiver down Mia's spine, and she knew, in that moment, what was coming next would be far worse than anything she could imagine. Before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments section where you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Mia's body trembled as Catherine's grip tightened on her arm. The fear in her chest burned hot, rising into her throat, making it hard to breathe. She nodded weakly, too scared to speak. Her eyes dropped to the floor, unable to look Catherine in the face. "Good girl," Catherine purred, her voice changing back to the sweet, saccharine tone she always used when Richard was home. "Now go to your room, and don't make a sound." Mia stumbled back from the door, her legs unsteady, her mind racing. As she turned away, she heard Catherine's heels clicking sharply against the floor, moving toward the kitchen, likely to prepare another meal, or perhaps to call Kyle, the man she'd just been kissing. Mia felt a lump form in her throat as she forced herself up the stairs. Her room was at the end of the hall, isolated from the rest of the house. As she stepped inside, she locked the door behind her and collapsed onto her bed. The tears she'd been holding back broke free, soaking her pillow. She couldn't stop crying, this time not just from fear, but from a deep, gut-wrenching loneliness. She had always felt like she didn't belong in this house. Catherine made sure of that. She wasn't just cruel to Mia in small ways. It was a constant, relentless assault on her sense of self. It had been like this for months. She hadn't dared to tell her dad, not since the first time Catherine told her, "No one cares about you, Mia. You're just a problem in the way." Richard, her father, was always away, always working. He had no idea what Mia was going through. He trusted Catherine completely. And Mia, she didn't know how to make him see the truth. She didn't know if he would even believe her. Catherine had him wrapped around her finger. The thought of telling Richard made Mia's heart race. She was terrified. Catherine had made it clear, if she told Richard, it would be the end of everything she knew. Mia would lose him. So she kept quiet. But something about today, about seeing Catherine and Kyle together, felt different. Mia had never seen her stepmother so careless, so exposed. It had been a secret she'd always suspected, but never witnessed firsthand. Mia wiped her face, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She had to hold it together. But the truth loomed over her like a storm cloud. And she knew, sooner or later, she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The next few days felt like a haze. Richard came home from another trip, his smile as warm as ever. Mia stood at the door, her heart sinking. How could she look him in the eye? How could she pretend that everything was okay when she was breaking inside? But as always, Catherine was there, acting as the perfect wife. She hugged Richard, kissed him on the cheek, and greeted Mia with a smile that barely reached her eyes. It was all a performance. And Mia hated it. Mia went to her room without saying much, trying to avoid being in the same space as Catherine. She couldn't bear the thought of being near her, not after what she'd seen, not after the things Catherine had said It wasn't long before Catherine called for Mia. "Mia!" she shouted from downstairs. Her voice was sharp, the sweetness gone. "Get down here. I need you to clean the bathrooms." Mia took a deep breath and walked down the stairs, her feet dragging. Catherine was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, a smug look on her face. "Get to it, and don't take all day," Catherine snapped. Mia nodded silently and made her way to the bathrooms. The house felt colder now. Every corner seemed to be filled with an invisible weight that pressed down on her chest. She couldn't even escape to the yard anymore. Catherine had made sure of that. She wasn't allowed outside when Kyle was around. Mia scrubbed the bathrooms in silence, the hours stretching on endlessly. The smell of bleach stung her nose, but it did nothing to mask the feeling that she was suffocating. The work didn't stop. It never did. Every day was the same. Chores, work, silence. When Richard came home, he never questioned why Mia seemed quieter or why she looked so tired. He always assumed it was just the stress of school or the loneliness of being in a big house without many friends. But Mia was no longer a child who could hide behind the silence. Something had shifted in her. She couldn't ignore the truth any longer, but she didn't know how to make Richard see it. Mia had never felt so invisible. Every day, Catherine made sure to remind her of her place, hidden in the background, out of sight, out of mind. When Richard was home, Catherine would shower him with affection, her sweet voice calling to him from the moment he walked in the door. But the moment he left, the mask would drop. Catherine's cruelty would be exposed again, like clockwork. Today was no different. Catherine's demands were relentless. "Mia," she shouted, this time from the living room. "You're not finished with the floors yet?" Mia's heart sank. She was exhausted. Her hands were sore from scrubbing, but Catherine didn't care. It never mattered. She was always expected to do more. Always. She reluctantly stood up from her small chair, feeling the weight of her body dragging her down as she made her way to the living room. Catherine was lounging on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, a look of contempt in her eyes as Mia entered. "You can't even clean the house right. Look at the dust on that table," she sneered, pointing at a spot in the corner of the room. "You're useless." Mia stared at the floor, her hands trembling, her throat tight with the words she couldn't speak. She wanted to tell Catherine to stop, to say something, anything to defend herself. But the fear held her in place. Her body wouldn't move, not without the terror of what Catherine would do next. She was helpless. With a forced, shaky breath, Mia walked to the table, grabbed the cloth, and began wiping the surface. Each pass of the cloth felt like an eternity. Catherine's eyes were on her the entire time, like a predator watching its prey. "Maybe Richard was right," Catherine muttered, her voice cold and low. "You are a burden. He should never have brought you into this house. I didn't ask for this." Mia's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them away. If she cried, Catherine would just call her weak, too sensitive. She wasn't allowed to feel anything. Not anymore. The sound of the front door opening broke the tension. Richard had returned. Mia quickly stood up, relieved to escape the weight of Catherine's cruel gaze. "Dad," she said, her voice a little too loud, almost desperate as she rushed to him. He smiled warmly at her. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, bending down to hug her. "How was your day?" Mia's throat tightened, but she smiled. "Good," she whispered, even though her day had been nothing but a chain of humiliations and exhaustion. Catherine, ever the perfect wife, stepped in, wrapping her arms around Richard. "Welcome home, darling," she cooed. Her voice was sweet, the kind of sweetness Mia had always associated with manipulation. Mia watched them for a moment, the hollow feeling in her chest growing heavier. This wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself. But it wasn't just about her anymore. She had to find a way to tell Richard, to make him see what Catherine had become. But how? How could she make him believe her? The silence between them was suffocating. Richard kissed Catherine on the cheek, then looked down at Mia. "You all right, kiddo?" Mia nodded quickly, not trusting her voice. She wanted to scream, to tell him everything, but the fear gripped her throat. Catherine's threat echoed in her mind. "If you tell your dad, I'll make sure he disowns you." Richard turned away, heading toward his office. "I'm going to catch up on some work. Mia, can you get me a coffee?" "Sure, Dad," Mia said, trying to sound as normal as possible. Catherine gave Mia a cold smile, her eyes glinting with something darker. "Don't take too long," she warned. "You wouldn't want your dad to be upset." Mia nodded quickly and hurried to the kitchen. Her hands shook as she prepared the coffee, her thoughts racing. "I have to tell him. I can't let her do this anymore." But what if Richard didn't believe her? What if Catherine twisted it all, made her seem crazy? The fear gripped Mia, as tight as ever. She couldn't let herself get caught up in what-ifs. She had to find a way to gather proof. She needed something solid. But what could she do? She was just a little girl, and Catherine held all the cards. That evening, after dinner, Mia had to retreat to her room. Catherine and Richard had a routine, always smiling, always the perfect couple. Richard talked about his day, his deals, his work, and Catherine listened, nodding as though she truly cared. Mia sat by her window, looking out into the garden. She could hear their laughter below, but it felt distant, almost foreign. She felt like an outsider in her own life, watching the two people who were supposed to care for her go about their day as though she wasn't even there. The days blurred together, each one blending into the next like an endless cycle. Mia had become accustomed to the feeling of isolation. It wasn't just that she was ignored. It was that her presence didn't seem to matter at all. Catherine's cold words echoed in her mind, always reminding her that she was nothing more than a burden. One evening, after Richard had left again for a business trip, Mia found herself sitting alone in the living room. The mansion was eerily quiet without her father. Catherine was in the kitchen, chatting with Kyle on the phone, her voice a soft, seductive murmur. Mia pressed her ear against the wall, straining to hear the conversation. But it was impossible to make out the words. She knew it had to be Kyle. Catherine had been sneaking off with him more and more, always when Richard was away. She hated the feeling in her stomach every time Catherine talked to him. But what could Mia do? She had nothing. As she walked down the hallway toward her room, Mia's eyes caught something that stopped her dead in her tracks. A piece of paper lying on the floor near the stairs. Curiosity tugged at her, and she hesitated before picking it up. It was a printed document. She glanced down at it quickly. Her heart sank. It was a legal document, an unsigned will. Mia's hand shook as she read the bold words at the top. Last Will and Testament of Richard Carter. She looked closer, and her stomach churned when she saw Catherine's name written as the primary beneficiary. With everything left to her in the event of Richard's death, there were also details about assets, properties, things Mia couldn't fully understand, but knew enough to know that it was wrong. Mia felt like the ground had been pulled from under her. This was it. This was the proof she needed. Catherine wasn't just manipulating Richard emotionally. She was planning to take everything from him, and Mia too. Before Mia could think further, the door to the kitchen opened. Catherine's voice called out sweetly, "Mia, come here." Mia quickly shoved the document into her pocket and hurried into the kitchen, trying to act normal. Catherine was standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot, but her eyes narrowed when she saw Mia's pale face. "Why are you looking like that?" she asked, her voice cold. Mia shook her head quickly, not trusting herself to speak. "I'm fine," she whispered. Catherine's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you're not up to something. You wouldn't want to upset your dad, would you?" Mia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She knew better than to answer. She didn't dare tell Catherine what she had found. "You're still on that floor cleaning duty, right?" Catherine snapped, her voice losing its sweetness. "Don't think you can get away with it just because Richard's not here." Mia nodded silently. "Good," Catherine said, dismissing her. "I'll make sure your dad hears about this. Don't make me have to remind him of how lazy you are." The venom in her tone was unmistakable, and as Mia turned away, she could feel Catherine's eyes drilling into her back. The next few days felt like a slow descent into despair. Mia spent all her time doing chores, barely eating, and staying out of Catherine's way as much as possible. She knew she had to act fast. She had to get the truth to Richard before it was too late. But how? Every time Mia tried to come up with a plan, her mind would get clouded by the fear of Catherine finding out. And with each passing day, the weight of her secret grew heavier. She couldn't live like this much longer. Mia's chance finally came when Frank, an old family friend of Richard's, came to visit. He had known Richard for years and had always been kind to Mia. She had seen him a few times in the past, always greeting her with a warm smile. But this time, he seemed different. He was walking down the driveway when he saw Mia sitting alone by the garden gate, her head buried in her hands, tears quietly streaming down her face. Frank stopped and approached her cautiously. "Mia?" he asked gently. "What's wrong?" Mia flinched at the sound of her name. She wiped her tears away quickly, not wanting to be seen like this. But Frank's kind eyes softened as he sat down beside her. "Mia, you don't have to hide. You can tell me," he said, his voice calm. For a moment, Mia hesitated. Her heart was racing. She knew she should tell him the truth, but the fear of Catherine's wrath held her back. But she couldn't stay silent anymore, not after everything she had seen and heard. I can't tell my dad," Mia whispered, her voice cracking. "Catherine, she..." Her words faltered as she struggled to find the courage to speak. Frank's expression darkened. "What's going on, Mia? You can tell me. You're not alone." Mia looked into Frank's eyes, and something inside her broke. She couldn't carry this burden any longer. The weight of her secret, of all the abuse, of everything Catherine had done to her. It was too much. "I saw something," Mia began, her voice barely audible. "Catherine and a man. I saw them kissing, and she said that if I told my dad, he wouldn't believe me. She said she'd make sure I'm gone." Frank's eyes widened with concern, but he remained calm. "Mia, you did the right thing telling me. You need to be heard. I'll help you, I promise." Mia's heart fluttered with a small, fragile hope. Maybe Frank could help her. Maybe, just maybe, someone would believe her. Frank's heart ached as he listened to Mia's fragile confession. He had known Richard for years and had always admired him for his dedication to family. But this was a side of the man he never imagined. One where his own daughter was silently suffering under the roof he thought was safe. "Mia," Frank said softly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions in his chest. "You're not alone. I'm going to help you. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself anymore." Mia sniffled, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her shirt. For the first time in a long while, she felt like someone truly saw her, truly cared. "Frank," Mia whispered, her voice trembling with fear, "I don't know what to do. I'm scared. Catherine, she'll hurt me if she finds out." Frank nodded, his expression hardening. He couldn't let Catherine's manipulation continue. He needed to act fast before it was too late for Mia. "You don't have to do this alone," Frank reassured her. "I'll gather the evidence. You just need to trust me, okay? I'll make sure Richard knows the truth. We'll put an end to this." Mia nodded, the smallest flicker of hope lighting up her eyes. Frank stood up slowly, brushing the dirt off his pants, and gave her a final look of reassurance. "Stay safe, Mia," he said gently, "and don't tell Catherine anything. We'll do this quietly." The following days were a blur of secrecy and careful observation. Frank, ever the quiet observer, started gathering information about Catherine's movements. He paid closer attention to the odd little details that were easy to miss, but in hindsight, would become the key to unraveling the full extent of Catherine's plan. He spoke with the staff, casually asking about Catherine's behavior, though no one seemed willing to speak up at first. But then, one evening, Frank overheard something that chilled him to his core. He was walking near the garden when he heard Catherine speaking to Kyle in hushed tones. They were arguing, quietly enough that no one else could hear, but Frank, with his sharp ears, caught every word. "He's too trusting." Catherine's voice was filled with venom. "I'll have him signing everything over to me. He'll think it's for the family's future, but once I have control, I'll take it all." Kyle's low chuckle was almost drowned out by Catherine's angry retort. "You have to keep Richard distracted. Let's convince him that Mia is unstable. We'll get him to think she doesn't deserve the inheritance. He'll be so caught up in trying to fix her that he won't see what we're really doing." Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of what he was hearing. Catherine wasn't just manipulating Richard emotionally. She and Kyle were planning to steal his entire fortune, all while keeping Mia in the shadows, ignored and dismissed. Frank knew he had to act. He couldn't let this go on any longer. He started digging into the financial records, getting in touch with Richard's lawyers under the guise of helping with some paperwork. What he found shocked him. Catherine had already been laying the groundwork for her plan. There were papers, trusts, and financial documents, all of them showing her as the primary beneficiary if anything were to happen to Richard. Frank's next step was to get concrete evidence. He needed more than just overheard conversations and a hunch. He had to gather indisputable proof that would expose Catherine and Kyle's scheme. He enlisted the help of a private investigator, someone discreet and skilled at finding the hidden truths people tried to bury. The investigator quickly got to work, trailing Catherine and Kyle, taking photographs of their meetings, and uncovering more shady dealings. Within a week, Frank had enough evidence to fill a file. He had photographs of Catherine and Kyle meeting in secret, emails that showed Catherine's manipulation of Richard's trust, and even recorded conversations where they discussed their plan to strip Richard of his wealth. The conspiracy was much deeper than Frank had initially feared. One evening, Frank stood in Richard's office, holding the file in his hands. His palms were sweaty as he looked down at the documents. Proof that the woman Richard had trusted, the woman he had married to give Mia a better life, was plotting to destroy everything he had worked for. He knocked on Richard's office door and stepped inside. Richard was sitting at his desk, his face lit by the soft glow of his laptop screen. He looked up, his face lighting up with a smile when he saw Frank. "Frank, good to see you, my friend. What's up?" Frank swallowed hard, the weight of what he had to say nearly choking him. He handed Richard the file, his fingers trembling. "Richard, we need to talk. It's about Catherine and Mia." Richard's expression softened. "What about Mia? She's been fine, hasn't she?" Frank hesitated, then sat down across from Richard, his voice low and serious. "Richard, I'm afraid there's something you don't know. Something I've uncovered that you need to hear. Catherine, she's been manipulating you, and she's been abusing Mia." Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? Catherine would never." Frank held up his hand. "I have evidence. Pictures, documents, everything. She's been planning to steal your wealth, and she's been using Mia as a pawn to keep you distracted." Richard's face paled as he opened the file. His eyes scanned the documents, the photos, and the emails. Each word, each piece of evidence, hit him like a punch to the gut. "How could I have been so blind?" Richard whispered, his voice cracking. He dropped his head into his hands, overwhelmed by the betrayal. "I've been so focused on work, I never saw what was happening in my own house." Frank's heart went out to his friend. He could see the pain on Richard's face, the overwhelming guilt. But they didn't have time for self-pity. Catherine and Kyle were still out there, still plotting, and the clock was ticking. "We need to act quickly," Frank said, his voice firm. "I'll get this to the authorities. We'll stop this before she can take anything more." Richard couldn't believe what he was reading. The woman he had trusted, loved, and married for the past few years was nothing but a fraud, a manipulator, a woman who had been plotting against him and his daughter all along. The guilt weighed heavy on his chest, suffocating him as he stared at the evidence in disbelief. "I never saw it, Frank. How could I have been so blind?" Richard whispered, his voice cracking with regret. "I've been so busy with work, so consumed with everything else, I didn't even see what was right in front of me." Frank placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't blame yourself, Richard. You trusted the wrong person, but now you know. And now we can fix this." Richard wiped his eyes and stood up, a fire of determination burning in his chest. "You're right. I can't let her get away with this. Not to Mia, not to me." He clenched his fists, his anger now replacing the guilt. "I'm going to make this right." The next morning, Richard wasted no time. He called his lawyer, an old and trusted friend, and instructed him to prepare for the immediate revocation of all trust agreements and assets that had been forged by Catherine. He couldn't afford to waste another second. Catherine and Kyle's plan had been in motion for months, and Richard had no intention of letting them get away with it. Frank, alongside the private investigator, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They had already gathered everything they needed: witnesses, photos, emails, audio recordings of Catherine and Kyle discussing their scheme. They were ready to strike. Richard stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city as the phone call ended with his lawyer. He felt a surge of hope, the first in a long time. He was finally doing something. He was finally taking control. The truth had come out, and there was no going back now. That evening, Frank met Richard at his mansion. The tension was thick in the air, but there was no time for hesitation. Frank had gathered all the evidence, and now it was time to confront Catherine. They couldn't wait any longer. Mia was upstairs in her room, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Richard couldn't bear to bring her into this until he had confronted Catherine first. Mia had already been through enough, and he wasn't about to let her feel the weight of this betrayal any longer. Richard and Frank walked into the living room where Catherine was sitting, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as they entered, a smile playing on her lips. "Richard, darling," she cooed, "I didn't expect you home so early." Her smile faltered when she noticed Frank standing beside him. "What's going on?" Richard stood still for a moment, his anger boiling beneath the surface, but he kept his composure. He placed the file of evidence on the table between them. "I think you know exactly what's going on, Catherine," Richard said, his voice steady but cold. "We have everything. The documents, the photos, the recordings. I know everything now." Catherine's face turned pale, but she quickly masked it with a fake smile. "Richard, you don't understand." "No," Richard interrupted, his voice firm. "You don't get to explain yourself. Not anymore." He slammed the file down onto the table. The noise seemed to echo throughout the room, reverberating through the walls. The sound of betrayal and broken trust was louder than anything else. Catherine's eyes flicked from the file to Richard, and then to Frank, who stood by the door with a steely expression. It was over. There was no way out now. "You've been using me, manipulating me," Richard continued, his voice shaking with disbelief. "And for what? To steal from me? To steal from my daughter?" Catherine's face twisted, her composure slipping for the first time since Richard had met her. "Richard, please, you have to understand." "No," Richard said, shaking his head. "I don't want to hear your excuses anymore." He took a step back, his chest tight with anger and betrayal. He couldn't believe he'd let her get away with this for so long. The doorbell rang. It was the police. Mia stood at the top of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd been listening from her room, overhearing parts of the confrontation. She couldn't stay hidden any longer. She had to know what was happening. She rushed down the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the hallway. As she entered the living room, her eyes met her father's for the first time since everything had started. There was no fear in his eyes anymore, only resolve. "Mia," Richard said, his voice softer now. "You don't have to be scared anymore. You're safe. I promise." Mia's breath hitched, and she stepped closer to her father, her arms trembling as she took the steps she had been so afraid of. She finally walked into the arms of the man who had always loved her, but had been too blind to see her pain. "Dad," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I should have told you everything. I was so scared." Richard knelt down in front of her, pulling her into his arms. "No, Mia. You don't have to apologize. You've been through so much. I'm the one who's sorry." Tears welled up in Mia's eyes, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief, tears that washed away the weight of the past months. She could finally breathe. Finally, she was safe. The police began their investigation immediately. Catherine and Kyle were arrested for their crimes. Their fraudulent financial schemes were exposed, and Catherine's manipulation of Richard was laid bare. The legal team worked quickly to secure Richard's assets and ensure that nothing could be stolen. Mia and Richard moved out of the mansion and into a new, smaller home. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. They would rebuild their lives together, and nothing could tear them apart again. 1 year later, Ishakis Mia stood in front of a crowd, her hands slightly trembling as she held the microphone. She was stronger now, no longer the quiet, fearful girl she once was. She spoke with confidence, her voice clear and steady. "You are not alone," Mia said, looking out at the faces in the audience. "I know what it's like to be afraid, to feel trapped. But you can speak out. You can stand up for yourself. And you're worth it." Richard watched from the back of the room, his heart swelling with pride. He had lost so much, but in the end, he had gained something much more valuable. His daughter's trust. They had made it through the darkness, and now they were walking into the light. Here brings us to the end of the story. If this journey through betrayal, courage, and redemption touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay connected with more powerful stories like this one. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us which part of the story connected with you the most. Was it Mia's courage in speaking out, or perhaps Richard's realization of the truth? Whatever it was, we want to know. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.